Okay, so now I want to begin our study of logic. And here's sort of schematically how I'm describing a formal deductive language. You've got kind of these red axioms, and you have these yellow arrows that represent deducing things from other things. And you've got theorems that can be deduced from the axioms. And I'm saying that to study mathematical logic is to study the yellow arrows kind of in isolation. How does deduction work? Without necessarily caring about exactly what the axioms are or what one is trying to prove. Just how does proving things, how does deduction work? But there's a bit of a problem. If we don't have any axioms, if we don't have any mathematical symbols and ways of forming mathematical sentences already in place, then how do we describe the arrows of deduction? We have nothing to deduce anything about, right? So if we have no propositions that we can write down yet, then how can we even discuss which propositions can be deduced from which other propositions? Or how can we even discuss the rules of deduction? So there are a couple of ways that we're going to address this problem. And the most important way is that we will use placeholders for propositions rather than actual propositions. So what we'll use is certain capital Greek letters, like the ones you're seeing in this list. Phi, psi, delta, gamma, omega. And we can introduce more if more are needed, but I don't think we really need any more than this. And these are not propositions, and they're not variables, but they are placeholders for propositions. So you can think of them like blanks saying, you fill in a proposition here once you have one. So we don't have any propositions to begin with, but we can put in these blanks in which propositions could be filled in later. So in terms of grammar, when you're writing, you can treat these like independent clauses. You can treat them kind of like they could stand as sentences on their own. So it makes sense to just write this with a period after it. This is supposed to stand for a proposition. It's not a proposition, but it stands for where you would put a proposition. It's waiting to be replaced by a proposition. It makes sense to say something like, I believe that phi. It makes sense to say that because this is a thing that you could believe or not. It does not make sense to say something like phi is good. That wouldn't make sense because phi is not a thing. Phi stands for an independent clause. So one way to test and make sure that these first two make sense and the last one doesn't make sense is replace phi by some English sentence. So for example, you could replace phi by the sentence, snow is white. Then this would say, snow is white, period. That makes sense. It makes sense to just say snow is white and then put a period after that. This one would say, I believe that snow is white. And that makes perfect sense. That's a perfectly grammatical English sentence. This one, if you tried to model a sentence based on this, you would say something like, snow is white is good, which doesn't make any sense, right? Maybe you could put quotes around it and say, this is a good sentence. I think that this statement that snow is white is good. Then that makes sense, but I didn't put quotes around this phi, right? So it doesn't make sense to write it like that. Okay, so the point is you can treat these as placeholders for propositions. And this way we can talk about ways of making deductions and which deductions are valid without having any actual propositions in hand, just having these placeholders. The second way that we're going to deal with the issue I mentioned at the beginning is that often we will actually use English sentences to fill in the place of these placeholders. These English sentences are stand-ins for what will later be mathematical sentences. So later we'll put mathematical propositions in place of these, but for the first couple of weeks of the course, while we're just studying logic on its own, while we're studying deduction on its own, it's just as good to put English sentences in place of these Greek letters.